The Wesley Centre for Theology, Ethics and Public Policy is a new Christian voice in the public square. And our vision is to stimulate dialogue on the ethical and social issues of our time so that all in society might flourish. And so we're delighted to be partnering with the Contemplative Studies Centre for this event, and we hope maybe many more. I think it comes at a perfect time in our world. There has been much turmoil, change and anxiety in public life, not least for those of us who follow American politics with deep passion, Cyprian's home country, but also because we're increasingly aware of the polarisation and lack of social cohesion in our community. And so it's perhaps more important than ever before that we have a diversity of voices in the public conversation, but particularly voices that speak out of the ancient wisdom traditions, including religious and spiritual traditions. Those of us who try to speak into the political sphere and public sphere to work for social change do so for the transformation of society. And it's important that we draw strength and peace from these deeper sources. As a centre for public theology, the Wesley Centre seeks to engage with people of diverse views, to be in dialogue with other scholarly disciplines, to learn from those of various faiths and none, and to adopt a posture of humility and openness in doing so. So I'm particularly pleased to be introducing a man whose life and work embodies so many of those values. Cyprian Consiglio is a Camaldolese monk, a musician, a composer, author and teacher. He's a native of Illinois, and he spent his young adult years in Arizona working as a professional musician. You're going to hear a bit of that tonight. Cyprian joined the new Camaldolese Hermitage in Big Sur, California in 1992. After his initial period of formation, solemn vows and ordination, he lived in a hermitage near Santa Cruz for 10 years, during which time he was travelling, performing, teaching, and working extensively in interreligious dialogue, music, and meditation. Much of Cyprian's music and his teaching revolve around the universal call to contemplation through spirituality and the arts. He has several collections of originally recorded music published through OCP publications as well as independent releases. Cyprian's also been part of an ensemble, the Collegeville Composers Group, responsible for Songs for Liturgy and Life with Liturgical Press. And as a student of the writings of Bede and Abhishatukanada, Cyprian has a great love for comparative religion and has published 3 books of his own for Liturgical Press, based on the wisdom gained from his studies. Most recently, Cyprian has been appointed the International Secretary General for Monastic Interreligious Dialogue. So Cyprian, over to you. We look forward to learning more and hearing from you for the next little while.
I want to start out with a bit of a disclaimer. Though I'm going to be speaking about the contemplative tradition, Christianity, I have to always explain that I'm kind of an eccentric among eccentrics for several reasons. First of all, because many people don't even know that there are such things as Christian monks. I was applying for my visa for India the last time. They're a little hard on Christian monks. They don't necessarily want Christian monks to come to India. And he said, what is your profession? I said, I'm a monk. He said, a Buddhist. I said, no, I'm Christian. Oh, they gave me another form to fill out to make sure I wasn't going to proselytize. So didn't even know there were Christian monks. Secondly, I come from a very small congregation. The Catholic monks are divided up into all these different congregations. I come from almost the smallest one in the whole Benedictine world, called the Camaldolese Benedictines, as Robyn mentioned. We're based in Italy, but my home monastery is on the Central Coast of California. We're very specific because we have the hermit tradition. We're the only Benedictine congregation that holds onto that hermit tradition, gives a container for that energy. On top of that, I kind of specialized from the beginning of my monastic life in East-West dialogue, having an encounter with this other monk that Robyn already mentioned, Father Bede Griffiths, who was an English Benedictine monk who went to India in 1949, before it was cool, started 2 different foundations before he wound up being the 3rd founder of our ashram in South India called Satchitananda Ashram, Shantivanam. So I specialized in that from the beginning, and that kind of set me apart in some way. And now I've taken on this role of Secretary General of this little organization for the Benedictine Confederation that works in interreligious dialogue. So it gets more and more specific, and on top of that, I walk around with a guitar. So please don't mistake me for being a typical Benedictine monk, but I can talk to you from my experience. I was remembering some years ago, I gave a talk for a high school called Mount Madonna. Mount Madonna is this amazing place in Santa Cruz, California, where I lived those 10 years. I actually did my yoga teacher training there. It started as just a little collection of students with their guru that they brought in from North India. Then they had a couple of huts, and then they built a yoga center, then they built a retreat center, then they built a grade school and a high school, and now they're even working on an associate arts degree. It's an amazing place. They're good friends of mine. And I was asked to go there and give a talk on Christianity. The same week that the Catholic high school asked me to come and go give a talk on Hinduism, which I thought was a really fun thing. And to explain my view of Christianity to them, my experience in Christianity, I brought 5 books with me that I thought would be really good visual aids. And I thought of those today as I was preparing my remarks. They kind of sum up my own understanding of these things. 5, yes. The first one would be this book called The One Light, which you can hardly even find anymore. It was done by a very obscure publishing company that's actually out of business now. It's the collective writings of this monk, Bede Griffiths, who was so influential on me. I met him just once before he died. As I was coming into the monastery, he was making his last trip to America on his way back to India, where he had a stroke and died afterwards. This is collected writings. Not only is it a view of Christianity, it's his view of interreligious dialogue, what he called universal wisdom. And I've really studied his life and teaching very deeply. He was educated at Oxford, tutored under C.S. Lewis. They were great friends. Matter of fact, C.S. Lewis dedicated his autobiography to Bede, the first one. And they both converted to Christianity about the same time. He brings this immense, beautiful world view to Christianity. He was a perennialist, if you know what that means, from the perennial philosophy, really of the same generation as Aldous Huxley. So it was there when Huxley was probably writing the perennial philosophy in the 1940s, refers to it, but very specifically thought of himself as a Christocentric perennialist, in the sense that he thought that the Christ event had a very specific market history as well. So I would say that would be the first, my basis. I sit in that universal wisdom with Father Bede. That was the phrase he used, universal wisdom, the wisdom that we share, which goes along with that perennial philosophy, the idea that the great wisdom traditions have something to teach each other, something to talk about, the wisdom we share in common. Secondly, I'd put right on top of that would be the Bible. I'm unapologetically a Christian. That's where my devotion lies. We had a wonderful conversation with a couple of people today. We were talking about devotion. I'm rather unashamed about that. I really fell in love with the gospel of Jesus when I was a teenager. And to this day, yeah, very devoted to that, and very devoted to the person of Jesus in my own prayer life, and studied Scripture extensively and still read it and meditate on it every day. So that would be the next thing. To get more specific, I'd put in there something like one of our great liturgical books from the Catholic tradition, because they've been so formed by the liturgical tradition of Catholicism specifically, would be very similar to the Orthodox or the Anglican communion liturgical tradition, I would assume. We actually share a universal lectionary between those different communions. Why do I say that? From my understanding of these things, and liturgy was actually my first discipline in theology. I taught liturgy and worked in liturgy since I was like 10 years old. I would say that in Roman Catholicism, and even more specifically in monasticism and religious life in general, it is the primary formative tool. I think that like when a young monk comes, he's getting more formation intellectually, spiritually, and in other ways too, even ritually, through the liturgy that he's getting almost from his own novice master, because scripture is coming through liturgy, because doctrine is coming through liturgy. Even when you go through the cycle of the liturgical year, you're getting formed like mythologically, you're getting formed ritually in that way through the cycles. All kinds of transformative things happen when ritual is done really well. But also we read so many other things besides the scripture in the liturgy, especially we have a liturgy we call vigils. Sometimes it's called the office of readings. That's very prolix. Unfortunately, it's often at 5:30 in the morning with long readings from what we call, mainly from the patristic era, from the first couple of hundred years of Christianity. And that's very formative also, besides the homilies that are offered. So I would say in Roman Catholicism, the liturgical traditions in general, and religious life specifically, the liturgy is very formative. And I have never really stopped practicing liturgy in all these years too, was very steeped in it. So that'd be my third level. The next level, I would say, would be the Rule of Benedict. The sister is also in a Benedictine tradition and the Anglican Communion. That would be the biggest container of Christian monasticism in the Catholic Church, at least. Most monks in the Catholic Communion follow the rule of St. Benedict. They come out of the 4th and 5th century. It's a very broad rule, very moderate in some ways, but in some ways it got imposed upon the whole, upon the Western Christian Church. But it's a very sound rule and very specific in that way. The motto that goes along with Benedictines is ora et labora. Now, some scholars of the rule that means prayer and work. Their life is based on prayer and work. Scholars of the Rule of Benedict would say it's not adequate. You should say ora labora et studia. The third thing you would add to that is study, because Benedict gives requires as much time for the monks, prayer, work, and he really wants them to study. There's a brilliant book out by a great scholar in Benedictine tradition called Jean Leclerc called The Love of Learning and the Desire for God. It's all about the history of intellectual history of the Benedictine order. So that would be another very formative element in my life, how I've been formed by being a monk in general. And then to get more specific, my own congregation, which I already mentioned about, the Camaldolese Benedictines, we were a reform from the 11th and 12th, I always get those wrong, 10th and 11th century. Our founder died in 1027, who brought in two things, let me say three things. First of all, he was heavily influenced by the Christian East, because this was a time in Italy when there was a big diaspora of Byzantine Christians coming down into the Italian peninsula, especially with the hermit tradition. And he was called upon to give some container, some form to this hermit life. Hermits can be notoriously anarchic. So he put the hermits under a rule and under an abbot. So there's two things, the influence of the Christian East, the hermit tradition, plus some of his first disciples were missionary martyrs as well. Some were sent off, you can't imagine it now, but in those days Poland and Hungary were hostile territories, barbarian territories. So some of his early monks went to Poland, some of them went to Hungary, and even on the Russian-Prussian border, and were martyred for that. So we call the charism, the special gift of our community, the threefold good. Community, there's the Benedictine part. Solitude, there's the Romuald part. And we don't like to name that third one, but it's something like missionary martyrdom. What I like to call it is absolute availability. Absolute availability. Silence, solitude, community, none of these things are ends in and of themselves. They're all means towards something else. This is my take on it anyway. They're means toward what? Absolute availability. We would say to the Spirit of God. Maybe another person might say absolute available to the Tao, to the flow of the divine, where the divine wants to take you somewhere. So that's another more specific thing. And I would add that to my top book would be the constitutions of my own congregation, the Camaldolese Benedictines. Father Bede Griffiths, who I've mentioned now twice, was actually a monk of an abbey called Prinish Abbey in England, in the Cotswolds. When he went to India, started a small foundation in Bangalore, and then helped found a big monastery, very successful monastery now called Kurusamala, and then took over from this Abhishektananda, our ashram now in South India called Shantivanam. At that point, up until that point, this is going from 1949 until the 1980s, he was what we call exclaustulated. He wasn't really attached to another congregation. And I have the great good fortune of the fact that he brought the whole ashram and himself into our congregation, into the Camaldolese congregation, and added a whole new dimension to my own monastic life, but to our monastic life in general. And we had a special mandate, especially since 1993 from Pope St. John Paul II, to engage in interreligious dialogue. Partly because of Father Bede's influence. In my mind, this third good that I talked about, in some ways, and my former prior general agrees with me on this one, is that third good. It's that soft spot now where the conversation really has to happen between the great faith traditions. So I'm very, very honored to be in that line, to be in that lineage, and now doing the work that I love to do by mandate, not just because I want to do it. What got left out of the biography that Robyn mentioned is after those 10 glorious years in Santa Cruz doing the work in interreligious dialogue and doing yoga teacher training and traveling all over the world singing and meditating, I was asked to go back and be the head of the monastery. So I just finished 10 years of doing administration, 10 and a half years, actually. And I started my sabbatical in January. And part of the sabbatical, I took on these different events around the world just to travel, to get out and have the conversation again. And in the middle of that, I was giving a retreat in a monastery in Minnesota, big monastery called St. John's in Collegeville, Minnesota, which is a great publishing house. And the current, at the time, head of Monastic Interreligious Dialogue lived there, and that's when I got my new job. He asked me if I would be his successor, and I didn't see it coming at all. And now at 66 years old, I'm starting to not do things rashly. And I said, let me think about it. And the next day I tested positive for COVID. And I wound up spending the next couple of days sick in bed, giving the retreat conferences from my bedroom, on Zoom. And I laid in bed and I thought, oh yeah, this is absolutely what I should do next. It seemed like such a specific call to cover everything that I love to do in terms of music, in terms of retreat, in terms of writing and teaching. I generally always do things from that perspective. So that job officially started for me on the 1st of October, and it kind of blended into my sabbatical year. And the great grace of it has been that the work I had already lined up folded right into the job and kind of expanded from that too, including my time with you here. What else I want to offer for you? In terms of contemplative practice and my own personal experience, one of the things I was asked to talk about was that along with interfaith dialogue influences. And those two things are kind of inseparable for me. Again, this is where I have a very kind of a rarefied experience, I suppose. So I entered in 1992. It's going on 33 years now. I didn't know anything about my Asian spirituality at all when I first entered. And I heard Father Bede speak this one Saturday morning. I think he talked for about 45 minutes. And I was this way when I walked in the room. I was this way when I walked out of the room. That's how I know somebody can have an impact on us in a very short time. Just change my way of thinking. He talked about two elements that I'm still ruminating on these years later. One of them was what he called the tripartite anthropology. We just did a retreat on it this past weekend for our oblates here in Australia. Meaning, instead of thinking of the human person as body and soul, that we always think of the person as body, soul, and spirit. We could go the other way around, spirit, soul, and body. He was very specific about the use of those words. body would also include the earth and our whole material being, including our sexuality and our psychosexual human development. For soul, he was very attracted to one of Ken Wilber's early books, which is called The Spectrum of Consciousness. That's the first book. Do you know if this philosopher from Colorado in the USA called Ken Wilber? His first famous book was called Spectrum of Consciousness. And Bede saw resonances with that, with some things he had learned from the Upanishads, from the Indian tradition, which I think the Asian traditions generally are much better than the Western traditions at this, of doing a kind of a map of the inscape. That's what I like to call it, the levels of consciousness. And this has been a fascination of mine now beyond these three decades. Because when we start a meditation process, we're actually going through these layers of consciousness. You could say going farther and farther out, higher, or you could say going deeper and deeper in. And so the Indian tradition, I think, and also the traditions that come out of India, like Buddhism, are brilliant at this, mapping out the inscape. And I think psychology has done that more for the West than spirituality has. And this is one of the great things that Ken Wilber has done, is lined up the spiritual traditions with the psychological traditions, the spiritual and the psychological, and kind of drawn a map for that in some way. So when I talk about soul, I mean it in the way that Father Bede talked about it. Soul is this great spectrum of consciousness that actually starts in the body with the senses, the emotions, the rational mind. This is why I don't like to say mind as opposed to soul, because the mind, the rational mind, is a part of the spectrum of consciousness. And it's a danger when the rational mind is separated from the rest of consciousness. It's that cold, masculine, rational, calculating mind. Senses, emotions, rational mind, intuitive mind. Father Bede loved to talk about that. He read a lot about Jacques Maritain and the whole, the artistic mind, the spiritual intuition, the higher forms of consciousness. All of that is the soul. And remember that the word soul in Greek is psyche, which is the root, of course, of psychiatry, psychology, psychotherapy. So psychiatrists, psychologists, psychotherapists at their best are soul doctors. They're helping us explore consciousness at their best, at their best. And beyond all that, then, is the realm of the spirit. Now, Father Bede used that in a very specific way. Our spirit, our human spirit, and this, I wrote my master's thesis on this, so I have way too much to say about it. Our spirit, like God's spirit, is beyond all phenomena. So when he used the word spirit, he always meant it to be that which was beyond all phenomena, beyond the realm of signs. And this would be the area of Advaita Vedanta, of Hinduism, not the neti of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, not this, not that. It would be the we would say apophatic, the silence of the Buddha, beyond all signs, beyond all things. It would also be, this has been my fascination for some years, of Taoism, the uncarved block of Taoism, that cannot be named. And there's this fathomless abyss to the Godhead. This would be the language also of like Meister Eckhart of the 13th century, the famous mystic, the fathomless abyss of the Godhead. St. Augustine says, if you understand that, it's not God. So we have that tradition in Christianity. We call it the apophatic tradition. Phasis in Greek means communication. Apophatic means against communication. There's a way of approaching God by no, not this, not that. Meister Eckhart would even say, God isn't light, God isn't love, God isn't any of those things. God is so much farther beyond those tiny little concepts that to say those things is almost like lying about God. So that's the spirit as far as Bede is concerned. And this is my words now, don't blame him. Just as there's an apophatic depth to God, to the divine, there's an apophatic depth to me. That's the great mystery of my own personhood. There's a fathomless abyss to me. And that's my spirit. And here, who I love to quote, is actually a Jewish rabbi. And I love when something in my own tradition gets affirmed and articulated by somebody from another tradition. His name is Arthur Green, American rabbi who specializes in Kabbalah. And I have this paragraph just about memorized. he's talking about the word neshama in Hebrew, which is the breath in the story of the second story of creation in the book of Genesis, the breath that God breathes into the mud that makes the mud into a nephesh, that makes the mud into a living creature who's Adam. And he says that is the place of connection between God and me, between the small self of my individual identity and the great self of capital B, being. And this is the sentence of the fourth sentence that I like the most. That aspect of me that never separates from the divine. We come forth from the divine, and there's an aspect of us that never separates from the divine. That even in that long process of individuation, which winds up being a process of an alienation, has never let go of its divine root. There's this belief that there's a part of the human person that is always has been, always will be, always is, in direct connection with absolute reality, whatever we call that. Hinduism might call it the ground of being and consciousness. We might call it the spirit of God. Taoism might call it the uncarved block. There's an aspect of us that's always has been, always will be in direct connection with that. And at that point, the process of meditation becomes not so much achieving anything, but I might use the word uncovering something, but my favorite word is realizing something. Realizing something. And this is where we were talking about this a little before the conference, where I feel like even consciousness studies and the spiritual traditions could talk to each other about this. Even some philosophical traditions, for example, like the work done by David Chalmers about consciousness, could have a conversation about this. Even people who are studying quantum physics could have a conversation with us about this. There's an aspect to reality itself. There's an aspect to being human that's beyond phenomena, but it's actually the foundational, it's the fundament, it's the ground from which we come forth, that we are somehow always, and always have been, and always will be in direct contact with. And the meditative process for me at that point, if we can use such a crass word as a goal, the goal is to realize that. And if I could be oversimplifying with this, the word realize means both to become aware of something and to make it real. And maybe, just maybe, those are not two different things. When I become aware of something, it actually becomes real. Or when it becomes real, I become aware of it. Like to say, okay, there's an aspect of reality and there's an aspect of being human that we don't uncover, that we haven't tapped yet. Maybe it's just deep consciousness. Maybe it's just that. Maybe it's what we call the spiritual realm. Maybe it's I'm looking for another word that I can't find. The causal realm. This would be a common word in the Indian traditions. And the interior journey is to realize that. And what we find along the way from various traditions is to realize that is a transformative experience. Like it changes us from the inside out. And there's just countless stories of enlightenment experiences, conversion experiences, change of life experiences from that realization. All that to say, meeting Father Bede in that encounter, that conference that he gave, set the tone for my own spiritual life. And from the beginning, I started studying both Asian philosophy and mysticism as I was learning monastic history and Christian mysticism, kind of in parallel paths. Along with that, our own ascetical life, our prayer life, our fasting. I started studying, first of all, meditation through the Buddhist tradition, specifically through the Soto Zen tradition of Japan, who I am very grateful for, who taught me some of them. We talked about this afternoon too, the mechanics of meditation, what you actually do, how would you control your thoughts, how would you calm your mind. A little bit later on that, and only 5 or 6 years later, I dipped more deeply into the yoga tradition. And I'm so grateful for the yoga tradition, mainly for this, to find out what to do with my body. Growing up a Catholic, I just figured out you just check your body at the door. You're really, it's cheeks up, most of the religion is, But in the yoga, it's already when you're meditating in the Buddhist tradition, any meditation practice, it's already bodily. But there's something so incarnate about the yoga tradition. Like what you do with your body matters. And I just love that. I didn't have that anywhere in my Catholic training. I was just at Shantivanam earlier this year, and our brothers sit for an hour at 5 in the morning, and then again at 5 in the afternoon. And I've been meditating for a long time, and I'm in pretty good shape. But for some reason, sitting on a cold cement floor for an hour was a little hard on this 66-year-old, 65 at the time. It was a little hard on my old body. And I had to get up in the morning and do some stretches before I went to the 5 o'clock meditation. It was the first time it was just as clear as a bell to me. This is why I do yoga asanas, so I can sit in meditation longer. It's just that simple. It's just so darn practical. I love to tell the story that here's a version of Christian yoga. We had an old recluse in our community. A recluse means somebody who didn't have to join us in community for almost anything at all. And he was very conservative, very devotional. And we used to go and have Mass with him if we were cooking. And I went and had Mass with him one day on a Sunday. In those days, you didn't have dessert any time during the week except on Sunday. And he said to me, "Watch what you eat on Sunday, brother. It's going to affect your prayer on Monday." I'm like, well, that's brilliant. What we do with our body affects our spiritual life. And I think the yoga tradition has taught me that, in multiple ways that I never learned in Christianity. Let me wrap up my short time here with saying for this. For me, this is one of the ways interfaith enters in. And we really have permission in the best of the Catholic tradition, even from the most orthodox voices, to do that exploration, of other techniques. There was a letter that came out from then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, who's a stalwart of Catholic conservatism, who said other traditions have sought union with God, have also pointed out ways to achieve that union. And just as the Church rejects nothing as good and holy in other religions, that's the official teaching of the Church, so neither are these ways rejected out of hand simply because they're not Christian. Rather, they can be taken up as long as the Christian conception of prayer with its logic and requirements is kept in mind. Now, to me, that's the best of my tradition. We reject nothing that's good and holy in another tradition. We don't even reject the other ways. Just remember who we are. Remember what our logic is. Remember where our devotion lies. So, last part of this, just to be practical about it, part of this spirit, soul, and body, practical aspect to it. I remember a monk in Colorado telling me once, who knew Ken Wilber quite well, and I don't know if this is actually true, but it should be true. He said Ken Wilber had a big room in a tower, and it was divided into 3 parts. And one part of it was a zendo, and one part of it was a library, and one part of it was a gym. And I thought, that's it right there. And I would say that kind of summarizes my practical spiritual practice as well. I would start with the gross all the way to the subtle. Exercise, yoga, reading, lectio, and part of my lectio is I'm always reading texts from other traditions as well as my own tradition, prayer, meditation. But I would add into that there's so many things you can add into that. My practices with my body have also taught me that my care for nature and ecology is now a part of my spiritual life, because I take that seriously, that incarnational aspect about it. And any kind of studies I do to expand my soul is part of my spiritual life, including playing the guitar every day. Like nothing is not a part of my spiritual life. Our guru up at Mount Madani used to say, all of life is yoga. And for me, I would say that about the spiritual life too. If we approach it with the right attitude, nothing is not a part of the spiritual life. I think I've gone over my time. Is that good for the first part?
Thank you, Cyprian. There's so much richness there. We do have some time now for questions, and if you're like me, you might have 25 of them in your head at least. So I'm going to suggest we just take a deep breath and see what is emerging as the most urgent question for you, and I'm going to encourage you to phrase it as a question, not a speech, while I pull up a stool. So let's just take a moment of silence.
Thank you. Hello. I was wondering if you could walk me through what your day is like and what your contemplative practices that you do in a day.
Well, my day is like, right now I'm on the road so much this year, so it's not a typical thing, but I've had a couple of months where I was all by myself. I wake up, my friends say, stupid o'clock. I get very, very early. I try to start the day with an hour of meditation, like first thing, silent meditation. An ideal day, the next thing I would do would exercise. If I'm somewhere near a gym, I would go and do like cardio for 40 minutes or so, and then some weight work, stretching, and if there's a sauna, get in the sauna. And then pray. I like to bring that, I like to go from the gross to the subtle that way. And then I would do my readings and prayers for the morning. I tend to combine, generally we have 4 or 5 prayers a day together. I combine it in three chunks, as we do at the ashram in India. So that would include reading from other traditions, chanting, psalms, scripture reading, some theological reading, plus intercessory prayer. So that's a good chunk of time also. Right now I'm reading a Taoist text, for instance, for the universal wisdom part, and I'm reading a theological book by a man named Ramundo Panikar. So that would be. Morning's a great time for me to work, to write, especially to write and study, prepare talks and things like that. I would generally, I eat breakfast at some point, but I always start the morning with a very, very strong cup of tea. So I have to admit that, with honey, as the king does, and oat milk. I'm just going to get real specific. Nobody's laughing. I'm trying to make a joke here. I find out that the king actually has honey in his tea, so I feel justified with that. I generally stop again at midday for another prayer, a little bit shorter, again with readings and scripture and intercessory prayer. It's usually a shorter one at that point. Afternoon's a good reading time for me, reading and writing time for me. And I always try to practice the guitar sometime in the afternoon. These days get really full with all these different activities. And then a good long meditation again at night. It's not always a full hour, but between 30 and 40 minutes at least, along with my evening prayers. And then that's it. I'm shot after that. I tend to do something really light in the evening, like light reading, or maybe watch. I have to admit, I like YouTube because I love watching music. And Italian, I like watching Italian news too, which is kind of funny. That's what a typical day would be like for me. Now I'm living with my community in Rome, and I'm kind of adjusting to it. They don't have prayers until like 7 or 7:30 in the morning, so I can still do my morning routine. And I found a gym and places I can run and things like that, so I'm kind of in an adjustment period for that. Thanks for asking. Yeah.
So I have 2 questions.
Okay.
So the first one is, what is the meditation like, the one you practice? And the second one is, you talked about you studied history of Christian tradition, right? And I heard, I don't know much about Christian tradition. So, and I heard that some of the Christian traditions used to have meditative practice.
Yeah.
And can you talk about about that a little bit.
Yeah. I already forgot the first question.
Meditation.
Yeah.
What do you like? Yeah.
We're going to do that together afterwards.
Okay.
So let's say that.
Yeah.
We use the word meditation in two different ways. Generally, in the Christian tradition, meditation means thinking about something and expanding on the thought. Like, it's a big practice, especially my Italian brothers, their meditation on Scripture. They call it Lectio or Lectio Divina. And they say they meditate on it. The Jesuits are big on this too. They meditate on it. It means they expand their thoughts out like that. Modern times, we use the word meditation more in the Asian sense, which is the opposite of coming down to one pointed concentration somehow. There's not a big tradition of that in Christianity. There are little snippets of it along the way. In the Desert Fathers, there's a hint of it in the Desert Fathers. The Hesychast tradition that came out in the 13th century out of Greece and went into Russia, monks of Mount Athos with the Jesus Prayer. A bit of it in St. John of the Cross, a bit of it in the Cloud of Unknowing. So there's not a whole lot of technique involved in it. Christians have never been big on technique. The closest thing we get would be from that Hesychast tradition too, where they talk about posture. They talk some things about breath, and the recitation of a prayer over and over again. But the silent meditation that is so popular now is something that's only been coming to the fore, I would say, in the past 30 or 40 years in Christianity. And I think we're rediscovering in our own tradition because of the influence of Asia. And I think it's a wonderful marriage of East and West, because it's the way I describe it. There was a time when I was having some issues with my heart and with kind of dizzy spells. And somebody recommended to me that I didn't have enough magnesium in my diet because I was a vegetarian. So I started taking magnesium, and actually it helped quite a bit. I'll have to say, silent meditation was the magnesium that was missing in my diet. And I feel like it's the thing that's been so many people, Western European people, have been hungering for and discovered it through Asia, but then picked it up so much that, there's even traditions of Japanese monks coming to California to study Zazen because, the Western people have gotten so good at it. Yeah. Does that kind of answer your question? Yeah. I haven't left any of my tradition behind, but I added that one thing to my diet that made a whole lot of difference to me.
I'm actually glad to hear that.
Which part are you glad to hear?
Well, glad to hear,
I'm just glad to hear that, all these traditions are coming to one place, and the soul, spirit, and all of the things that you said today. So I'm more of a Buddhist tradition, and all of you said totally makes sense to me.
We have a lot to share with each other. We have a lot to share. And I think quite often Christians going to the dialogue feeling very apologetic, like we only have things to learn and nothing to share, But I think we have a lot to share also in the wisdom as well. Thanks for the question.
We might go to this side of the room. Just wait for the microphone, please, so that we can all hear you.
You put a nickel in my machine now, never stop talking.
Watch
You
the
gotta
time.
stop
Yeah,
it.
that's good.
Cyprian, what might you say to people who have a desire for meditation but find the process very difficult?
I would say welcome to the human race. At 33 years, I still find it difficult. Yeah, it really is a discipline. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work because it's so subtle. But I think it's really worth the work. And also, I think that, these are all kind of crass words again, mind you, I think that there are benefits just in the effort. Even if we don't feel anything going on, we have no idea what's going on in our deep psyche when we do this work. I've been doing a lot of reading of the Yoga Sutras again this year, of Patanjali, and especially the commentaries by Prabhavananda. There's a little book called How to Know God, which I would recommend to anybody. This is fabulous, just universal wisdom of the spiritual life, and very practical as well. Commentaries of the Yoga Sutras. He's talking about the samskaras. deep in our model language, we call it our subconscious. There are scars. There are things that have happened to us. We don't even know they're there. It's so deep in our subconscious. But he says they're like sandbanks. They're affecting the tides and they're affecting how ships go over them. We don't even know they're there, but they're affecting us deep in our consciousness. But he says, in meditation, we're actually lowering those sandbanks. We don't even know it. But it's at such a deep level, healing is taking place. So I would say people who are struggling with it, welcome to the human race. It's hard work, and keep at it. Even if we don't feel anything, we have no idea what healing effect could be going on deep, I think deep in our psyches in that way. Yeah.
While the microphone moves behind, can I ask you to just clarify, you've talked about you have a period of meditation that you've distinguished from prayer. Now, some Christians would, and other traditions might think about prayer and meditation as melding or merging, and I don't mean the kind of prayer that's talking at God.
Yeah.
Can you just tease out what that distinction means for you, and is there overlap, and how that functions in your practice?
I would say it's much more, we talked about that this weekend, it's much more a melding. There's John Main, who was the inspirer for the Christian meditation movement. His first and most famous book is called Word into Silence. And I love the idea of the motion of that. Like everything kind of resolves itself into the silence, goes beyond words, and then the place beyond words actually becomes the source for words as well, So the words go into the silence, but the silence also produces the words. Yeah. So I don't make a fine distinction between them, but there are some periods when I'm not reading and I'm not doing vocal prayer and I'm just focusing on the interior journey.
Yeah.
That would call that the strict time of meditation.
Okay. Thank you. This gentleman just here.
Thank you, Cyprian. I was wondering if you ever came across Bernadette Roberts at your time in Big Sur, and
well, she used to come to our monastery quite
I'm
regularly.
aware, yeah. I found her writings incredibly powerful and influential to me, and I'm just curious about her person and
Curious about
her person, how she carried herself, and also kind of what you make of her offerings or her writings. And,
Yeah. I'm kind of a complicated answer to that. She had a really big, very loyal group of disciples that came with her every year to the Hermitage. And if I understand correctly, she actually kind of took a turn toward the end of her life and got very devotional, very, very Catholic, to the point where one of the monks that she talked with, they were arguing about it because she got more Catholic than him in some way. And I'm not sure exactly how that manifested itself, but her group kind of disbanded a little bit around that. Do you know, her followers founded a church in Austin, Texas called the Church of Conscious Harmony. Have you ever heard of that? And they're still going. Father Thomas Keating, do you know the name? And he's quite well-known author, and I met him several times. And in my last conversation with him, he thought very highly of her. But Father Thomas was doing a lot of speculation about the idea of the self, which should sound familiar, Martin. We had that conversation this afternoon. And the idea of the no self. And Father Thomas thought she was really onto something, kind of non-dual experience in that. I wouldn't go necessarily as far as she went with that language. I'm much more cautious about it. And how she reconciled that with her very devotional conservative Catholicism at the end, I'm not really sure. But yeah, I know enough about her to know that she was a lovely person, very strong person also. And I think at the end of her life, she couldn't speak anymore. She lost her ability to speak, which was kind of a really holy moment for everybody around her as well. How do you know her at work?
Actually, my friend Ruth was just there.
Oh.
My friend Ruth actually introduced me to her work, and yes, that book, The Experience of No Self. She described a permanent state that I feel like I'm
sorry, a little louder.
So she described in that book, The Experience of No Self.
Yeah.
This what she claims is a permanent falling away
Yeah.
of the sense of self. And I can understand that experience as something temporary. But her claim that her sense of self kind of permanently left is very bold and shocking, and I'm curious about it. Yeah.
Yeah, and Father Thomas was doing a lot of speculation about that, and he actually instructed me to read a couple of books to think up on it. It's one of my favorite topics to explore with people. We were talking about this afternoon, even the difference between the Indian understanding of the self from the Buddhist understanding of the self, and then to the prophetic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and the notion of self. And even with consciousness studies and people who are dealing with quantum physics, what they have to say about whether there's a permanent abiding self or not. Thanks for bringing that up.
There are other questions? Yes.
Thanks very much, Cyprian, for your presentation today. Where do you see the link between the contemplative life that you're describing and social action?
Oh, that's a great question. My first response to that, maybe it's more of a reaction, one of the ongoing themes I've had in my own teaching, especially when I was the head of the monastery, is I feel like this sharp division that we have in Roman Catholicism, the active life and the contemplative life, is a real false dilemma. As Jesus says about other things, it's just given to us because of the hardness of our hearts. But because our human tendency is so extroverted, because so many of us live outside of ourself, I think there's always going to be a place for the purely contemplative life to kind of anchor the rest of the body in some way, because so many people are not dealing with the interior life. I think there's always going to be a place for the purely contemplative life. I do, though, think the ideal for most of us is to find that breathing in and breathing out. This is the talk I was giving at a parish last night. These two images from Christian scripture. St. Paul says, the love of God is poured into our hearts by the Spirit living in us, meaning the Holy Spirit living in us. And Jesus says, streams of living water will flow out of the believer's heart. And John says he was talking about the Holy Spirit. So somehow the whole spiritual life is summed up in the love of God pouring in and the love of God pouring back out. The love of God pouring in, the love of God pouring back out. From my experience, coming from a contemplative tradition, there can be a danger in the contemplative traditions of it becoming stagnant, of it actually not being creative, being dead energy and not expressing in any way, not only just in art and literature and writing, but St. Basil the Great had this great line. He said, "Hermit, whose feet will you wash?" So I think that's a good warning shot across the bow. But it's not just in Christianity. Here's an obscure little thing. There's speculation that the Bhagavad Gita, even though it was written much before then, became popular in the first centuries of the Common Era as a response against the Upanishadic monastic tradition in India, which tended to be so insular and keeping enlightenment just to the few monks up in the Himalayas, like breaking out of that. And Krishna, and I don't want to say it's like already chapter 4 of the Gita, is saying these are the real sannyasis, these are the real renunciates, those who can work without claiming any of the fruit of their work. This is the real renunciation. So the polemic goes on in different traditions. And also, there's such a thing, I think especially in Thich Nhat Hanh's branch of Vietnamese Buddhism, I think they coined this phrase of socially engaged Buddhism, where we'll say that they learned that from Christianity, that feeling that the Buddhism itself needed to be more socially engaged. And this is, I would hazard to say, I hope I'm not wrong about this, kind of more of a Western phenomena than an Asian phenomena, where Buddhism became, certainly in the States, Buddhism became very active in politics and environment and things like that. Yeah, so I would say it's the active and the contemplative are kind of a false dilemma, but we're always going to need the contemplatives to anchor us because most people are not contemplative. Muslims who don't have any contemplative practice at all. Yeah. Thanks. Way back there.
We've got, yep, the end of the row there.
I wanted to ask, what about the other Camaldolese communities, especially the Italian ones, the first one in close to Arezzo? Are they following this trend also, or because I visited a lot of years ago and it was not like this, so I'm wondering if they are now following similar a similar idea, or they are spreading this a similar idea of a communion between the old traditions and then meditation and yoga and whatever. Or
Lei di Italia? Di Arezzo? Lei? Da dove? Oh sì. Ma conosci la nostra comunità? I would say it's a kind of a mixed bag. Un po' mescolanza. There's, in this day and age, there's definitely some of our guys who are suspicious of this whole enterprise that I'm up to, for instance. One of our monks has actually recently written a pamphlet arguing against what he feels like is some of the excesses of the adaptation of the ways of India. At the same time, there are a couple of monks who are very, very deeply involved, but only a couple. One of our monks, who's actually from Germany, lived in Italy for the first 20 years of his monastic life and is a very accomplished yogi and a very well-respected yoga teacher throughout Italy. He didn't feel supported. Now he's moved back to Germany, to one of our monasteries there, but he still comes to Italy to teach. So it was much more prominent 25, 30 years ago, especially when I first entered. The younger generation is a little more suspicious about it. And which may sound kind of surprising, but in Catholicism, in the late years of the papacy of John Paul II and then under Pope Benedict, it was kind of a theological freeze. And things really pulled back. A lot of young people only knew those papacies, only knew that church, the Church of John Paul II and of Pope Benedict. And they view, like my generation, as the old generation, the Second Vatican II generation, as if it were only a generation, not an ecumenical council of the church. I think under Pope Francis that may be thawing a little bit. There's a little bit more openness. But it's kind of a mixed bag, yeah. I'm not sure all of my brothers were all that excited that I got this job, for instance. Working for the Benedictine Confederation, and like, oh, okay. And do you have to live with us? And I'm living with our Italian brothers in Roma, adesso, yeah.
I think, speaking as a Protestant, there's a similar suspicion in strands of Protestant Christianity as well. We are almost out of time, so I just want to ask a last question, and then I'm going to hand over to Nicholas.
Okay.
You embody this, dialogue is not even the right word, it's an interreligious engagement or embrace that I think is so wonderful, and it picks up on this last question. But you also model holding, you know where your centre is. So can you just say something about, like, there's this posture of sort of a confident humility that lets you engage, but not in a way that I think the suspicion is often about, where you don't, it's not a unthinking embrace, neither is it saying everything's just the same. So tell us about, I don't know if centre's even the right language because that assumes a certain something, but how do you hold these traditions together for yourself?
Yeah, I'm going to tell the same story I was telling with these folks this afternoon. I was doing a retreat with the abbot of Zen Center, the former abbot of Zen Center at a place called Tassajara in Carmel Valley in California. And we'd finish one session, it was dialogue between the two traditions, and then at the end of every session we would talk about what we were going to talk about the next session. And I suggested to him that the next session we could talk about our devotion. I could talk about my devotion to Jesus. And he said to me, "You mean your devotion to Christ?" And I said, no, I mean the Jesus. No, but surely you mean Christ, like the Christ consciousness, kind of very clever thing. And I said, no. I said, I think my devotion, like your devotion is really to the Buddha, mine is to Jesus. He says, I'm not devoted to the Buddha. And I said, okay, that's what we're going to talk about next session. And I said, and we had the conversation in front of everybody. And of course I went out and took notes and prepared myself to win. But and what I suggested to him was, why my devotion is to Jesus is because, and why I thought his devotion was to the Buddha, if this transformation didn't actually happen in a real human being, the heck with it. If it's just a myth, it's just a vague theory, forget about it. But if somebody was actually transformed by the practice, and I said, because Siddhartha Gautama, the prince, had a transformative experience, that's what gives this tradition credence. And I was just so attracted to the person of Jesus. And I tend to use the word Jesus instead of Christ, because I don't want it to be vague. I don't want it to be distant. This was this man who had this transformative experience of the benevolence of absolute reality. And if you stand on the banks of the Sea of Galilee and see what Jesus saw, I still get goosebumps thinking of it. Standing on this and thinking, this is where Jesus, I saw this flock of sparrows, fly. I'm like, oh, I get it, yeah.
Thank you. We're out of time. I'm going to hand over to Nicholas to do a formal word of thanks.
Thank you so much for that incredible and inspiring talk. It sort of highlighted so many things for me, I'm sure for many of you as well, particularly thinking about sort of being careful where we see boundaries and being open to exploring what's in those boundaries and why they're emerging for us. And I particularly like the comment you made about how in your tradition you approach practices from other traditions, which is sort of kind of not rejecting them out of hand or outright, but remembering who we are. And I thought that was a really beautiful way of thinking about how we might all engage with different styles of practices. And just finally, a note for me is I think what really jumps out for me is this need to not neglect different aspects of ourselves. The mind, the body, the spirit, however you want to frame them or term them or think about them. It's really important that we look after all of these things. And I think in the context in the world that we live in, we spend so much time kind of either stuck in our heads or trying solely to fix the body and neglecting things like the spirit. And I think it's really important that we, again, don't resurrect or identify those boundaries where they may not actually exist. Please join me in thanking Cyprian for a lovely inspirational talk and guided practice.
Thank you.